The scary truth about your shadow self. Let me offer you a small resolution before we begin. Something to carry with you, rather than just hear. First, I stop assuming that my good opinion of myself is the whole truth of who I am. Second, I agree to look at what I have refused to look at, without punishing myself for finding it. Third, I choose awareness over avoidance. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, I make the unconscious conscious. Before we go on, if this kind of thinking is useful to you, consider staying close so tomorrow's teaching finds you too. And if something in what I just said landed, if some old unexplained moment in you just went quiet and recognized itself, type the words "face it" in the comments, just those 2 words. Let them be a small private marker that you are willing to look. The first key is, your shadow is not a monster, it is simply what you would not look at. Jung defined the shadow with a plainness that surprises people who expect something occult. He wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is, from CW 11, paragraph 131. Read that again slowly. He is not describing evil, he is describing weight, density, the simple physics of what happens to a part of you that never gets used, never gets acknowledged, never gets invited into the room. It does not disappear because you ignore it. Wit thickens. Think of a closet you have not opened in 10 years. Nothing in there became more dangerous by sitting in the dark, but it did become harder to open the door. That is the shadow, not a demon, a backlog. Every impulse you called unacceptable, every reaction you decided was beneath you, every appetite you labeled shameful and filed away. It is all still there. It did not evaporate when you stopped looking at it. It just went underground and kept living, without your permission and without your awareness. Now imagine an ordinary Tuesday. Imagine someone, call her composite, who prides herself on being easygoing. Nothing rattles her. That is the story she tells at dinner parties and half believes herself. She wakes late, feels a spike of irritation at her own alarm clock, laughs it off before it even finishes forming. At work, a colleague takes credit for her idea. She feels something hot rise in her chest. She swallows it, tells herself it does not matter. At lunch, she scrolls past a friend's good news and feels a small, ugly twinge she would never say out loud. She closes the app. By evening, she is snapping at someone she loves over a dish left in the sink, and she tells herself it is just tiredness. None of these moments felt large enough to name. Each one dismissed in under a second. And that is precisely the mechanism Jung was pointing to. The shadow is rarely a single dramatic confession. It is 100 small, unexamined moments a day, each one so minor on its own that no one would ever call it evidence. But the ledger keeps a tally, even when you do not. This is the first correction worth making tonight. The scary part is never that darkness exists in you. Every person alive carries some. The scary part is only the density that builds when you have refused it for years, quietly, unremarked. One dismissed Tuesday at a time. So if a small unwanted impulse surfaced in you today, a flash of envy, a petty thought about someone you love, a flicker of irritation you swallowed before anyone saw it, you are not discovering that you are secretly bad. You are discovering the ordinary weather of being human. And once you can say that plainly, without flinching and without excusing, the fear already loses half its grip. This is not a call to confess every small feeling to the world. It is simply an invitation to stop lying to yourself about having them at all. I stop mistaking an unacknowledged part of myself for an evil one. The second key is, the brighter the image you present, the denser the shadow you are carrying. This is the part of Jung's teaching that unsettles people who have worked hardest to be good, because it means the very effort to be admirable can be quietly building the thing you fear most. Picture a lantern held high on a dark road. The brighter it burns, the longer and blacker the shadow stretches out, behind the one holding it. That is not a flaw in the lantern. That is simply how light behaves, and it is exactly how the psyche behaves too. The more radiant the self-image, the more there is standing behind it, unlit, unexamined, and quietly growing. Imagine a man, call him composite, who in 40 years has never once raised his voice, never argued, never said an unkind word. His family calls him the gentlest man they know. His friends comment on how even-tempered he is, how nothing ever seems to rattle him, and for decades this feels like a genuine achievement, a character trait he is proud of, a kind of quiet reputation he has built his whole identity around. But Jung would ask a harder question here. Where did the anger go? Because anger is a normal human reaction, appropriate in its place, a signal, a boundary, a form of honest information, and a person who never shows it even once across 40 years has not eliminated it. He has only refused to let it live anywhere conscious, so it goes underground, and it accumulates there, quietly compounding, like a debt no one is tracking. So one day it does not arrive as a raised voice, it arrives as a sudden explosion that frightens everyone who thought they knew him, over something almost too small to name. Or it arrives sideways instead, as a strange coldness toward the people closest to him, a withdrawal no one can explain, an illness that has no clear cause, a decision that makes no sense to anyone, including him. Now imagine the reverse case too, a woman, also composite, known her whole life as the selfless one, the one who always gives, who never asks for anything back, whose whole identity rests on being needed rather than needy, and for years this looks like generosity of spirit, but underneath it, unspoken, unexamined, sits a growing account of resentment. Every unmet need she has quietly buried in the name of being good, and it does not vanish either, it waits. Notice that in both cases the mechanism is identical. It makes no difference whether the polished image is gentleness or generosity, patience or piety. The shape being built in daylight determines the shape gathering at night. A taller steeple casts a longer shadow across the churchyard. That is simply geometry, not punishment. Think for a moment of your own most trusted description of yourself, the word a close friend would use to describe you at your best, whatever that word is. Ask honestly what it would cost to let it crack in public for even 5 minutes. If the very thought makes your stomach tighten, that tightness itself is worth noticing, because it usually marks exactly where the shadow has been quietly gathering, behind the very trait you are proudest of. This is the pattern Jung kept finding. The brighter the ideal a person builds in daylight, the denser the shadow that gathers at their back. This is not a reason to stop trying to be decent. It would be a strange kind of teaching if it were. It is a reason to stop confusing decency with the total absence of what is inconvenient. The goal was never a spotless image, held up like a lantern for others to admire. The goal is an honest one, held steady enough to actually see by eye. I let my goodness be honest, not a performance built over a debt I never paid. The third key is, facing this is not a casual glance. It takes what Jung called considerable moral effort, in Ion, paragraph 14, and it is worth sitting with that phrase for a moment, because moral effort here does not mean gritting your teeth and trying harder to be good. It means something almost the opposite. It means the effort of staying still long enough to see what you would rather not see, without immediately trying to fix it, excuse it, or punish yourself for it. That stillness is harder than it sounds. Most of us have spent a lifetime training ourselves to look away quickly, a flash of jealousy toward a sibling, and the mind moves on before the feeling is even named, a small cruelty in a passing thought, and the mind calls it nothing. Moral effort is the discipline of not moving on quite so fast. Let me be even more precise about what this effort is not. It is not confession. You do not need to announce every flicker of envy or spite to the people around you. That would be a different kind of avoidance, dressed up as honesty. And it is not self-punishment either. Sitting with a dark impulse and then spending the evening telling yourself what a terrible person you secretly are is not moral effort. It is simply cruelty, wearing the mask of insight. The actual effort is quieter than either of those. It is the willingness to hold a feeling in view for a few extra seconds, without narrating it into something worse, and without erasing it into something smaller, just letting it be seen, exactly as large as it actually is. This is why Jung called it moral rather than merely psychological, because it asks something of your character, the willingness to be honest with yourself, even when no one else will ever know the difference. Jung recalled in his memoir, A Dream from His Own Life, that captures this exactly. He was walking at night in a fierce wind, carrying a small storm lantern, its flame threatened constantly by the gale, and behind him, he became aware of an enormous shape following close at his heels, a gigantic black figure keeping perfect pace with him, and only later, looking back at the dream, did he understand what it was. It was his own shadow, cast by the very lantern he carried. The light he held to see his way forward was the exact thing throwing that huge shape behind him. And here is what strikes me most about that image. He did not throw the lantern down. He did not run. He kept walking, carrying the small flame through the wind, with the shadow following the whole way. That is the posture Jung is asking of you, not to defeat the shadow, not to extinguish the lantern out of fear of what it casts, just to keep walking, aware now of what walks behind you. Now picture an ordinary version of this same climb, a man driving his children home from evening practice, tired, hungry, the radio low, someone cuts him off without signaling, and something in him ignites far past what the moment actually warrants. His hands tighten on the wheel, a string of words rises in his throat that he would never want his children to hear. He swallows them, exhales, tells himself it is only traffic, and in one sense it is. But the size of the reaction is the tell. A small event should produce a small feeling, and when the feeling arrives 3 sizes too large, something older is speaking through it, some earlier helplessness, some old fury from a different room entirely, borrowing this moment to finally get some air. The easy path is to let the explanation of tiredness close the door on the question immediately. The harder path, the one requiring what Jung called moral effort, is to notice the disproportion itself, to ask quietly, later, once the children are inside and the house is calm, what was that, really? Not to solve it that same evening, not to diagnose it fully, only to admit that it happened, and that it meant something. Think also of the woman who has spent her whole career being called the reasonable one in every room, the one who never raises her voice in a meeting, who smooths things over, who is trusted precisely because she seems to want nothing for herself. And one evening, a colleague gets the promotion she quietly believed was hers, and for exactly 4 seconds, something hot and ugly moves through her chest. A wish that the colleague fail, a flicker of pure spite, and she is horrified by it, not because the feeling is so large, but because it does not match the person she has spent 20 years believing herself to be. The easy move is to slam the door on that feeling immediately, to tell herself she did not really mean it, to bury it back down where it came from. The harder move, the one requiring what Jung called moral effort, is to let the 4 seconds simply have happened, to notice them without either indulging them or disowning them. That noticing is not comfortable. It rarely feels like progress in the moment. It feels like catching yourself in something shameful. But this is precisely where the work is done, not in some dramatic confrontation with your own evil, but in these small, unglamorous seconds of staying present to what you actually felt, rather than the polished story of what you meant to feel. And notice something else about both of these small scenes, the man in the car and the woman at her desk. Neither of them acted on the impulse. Neither of them said the cruel word or wished the failure aloud. The moral effort was never about behavior in that instant. The behavior was already fine. The effort was entirely inward. It was the choice to actually look at what had risen. Rather than pretending only the calm surface was real, this is why so few people ever do it consistently. It is not that the shadow is hard to see. It announces itself constantly, in small ways, all day long, in traffic, in meetings, at family dinners, in the space of 4 seconds or 4 minutes. It is that staying with it for even a few extra seconds asks you to tolerate being, briefly, someone other than your favorite version of yourself. And that tolerance, held again and again, in ordinary moments, on ordinary days, is the whole of the courage Jung was describing. Not a single heroic reckoning, but 1,000 small refusals to look away too quickly. The storm does not end because you finally notice the shape behind you. The wind keeps blowing. The road keeps going, but you walk it now with your eyes open, which is a different thing entirely than walking it blind. I carry the lantern, and I do not run from what follows it. The fourth key is, the shadow speaks first. In the moments before you decide anything at all, this is where people get the most frightened, because it can feel like being ambushed by your own mind. A sharper word than you meant, a slip of the tongue in a meeting, a mood that descends with no clear cause, an overreaction to something genuinely small. These are the places where the shadow finds its way through the fine hairline cracks in the mask you present to the world. The persona is smooth and practiced, but it is not seamless. And the shadow does not wait for your permission. It uses the gaps. Notice that it never announces itself in advance. It does not politely request a hearing before your monthly staff meeting or your family dinner. It simply arrives first, faster than thought, faster than the version of you that would have chosen differently given a moment to think. That is precisely why it frightens people. They assume the self that speaks in that instant must be the truest self, when really it is only the least guarded one, the one that slipped out before the mask could be adjusted back into place. Think of the last time you said something and immediately thought, that did not sound like me. That small aftershock of surprise is worth pausing on, because it is data. It is the shadow announcing that it has been unattended for some time. Let me offer you an ordinary scene. Imagine a woman, call her composite, known at work for being unshakable, easygoing, the one colleagues bring their stress to because she never seems to carry any of her own. One afternoon, a junior co-worker asks a simple clarifying question in a meeting, nothing pointed, nothing unkind, and she hears her own voice snap back with a coldness that startles the whole room, including her. She apologizes within seconds, blames a headache, and the meeting moves on. But that night, the moment keeps returning to her, uninvited, because she knows a headache did not write those words. Something else did. Something that had been waiting behind the smooth mask of unshakable. For longer than she realized. Notice too what happens the following week. A second small crack appears. This time at home, her partner leaves a cabinet door open for the third night running, a thing she has never once mentioned before, and she finds herself saying something disproportionate, something that surprises them both. And if she is honest, these two moments are not unrelated incidents. They are the same pressure, finding two different doors. The instinct most people have in that moment is to explain it away instantly. I was just tired. I was just stressed. And sometimes that is simply true. But Jung would ask you to hold the question a little longer than that. Not as self-accusation, but as honest curiosity. What part of me said that, and what has it needed to say for a while? Notice too that the crack rarely opens in private. It tends to open exactly where the mask is thinnest, in front of the people who expect the polished version of you most. That is not bad luck. That is the shadow choosing its moment with a strange kind of precision, almost as if it knows the mask is watched most closely, exactly there, and cannot resist the one gap wide enough to slip through. The crack in the mask is not a failure, it is an opening, and openings can be looked through. If you are willing, I notice the crack in the mask, instead of quickly plastering over it. Before the fifth key, if this is helping you see something in yourself more clearly, stay close so tomorrow's teaching can reach you too. It costs you nothing but a moment, and it may be exactly the moment you needed. The fifth key is the one that carries the real weight of everything we have said tonight, and it unfolds in 3 parts, so stay with me through all of it. First, consider what it actually means to make the darkness conscious. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious, from CW 13, paragraph 335. Notice the shape of that sentence. He is correcting a very natural mistake, the idea that growth comes from picturing yourself as more virtuous, more evolved, more spiritual. He says the opposite. Growth comes from turning directly toward what you have called unworthy in yourself, and looking at it plainly, not decorating it, not excusing it, not exaggerating it into something monstrous either. Simply seeing it. This is uncomfortable because it asks you to stop managing your self-image for a moment and just observe. And there is a reason this single sentence has outlived nearly a century of imitation and paraphrase, because almost every tradition of self-improvement quietly assumes the opposite direction. Picture the light, dwell on the light, affirm the light until the darker material simply fades from relevance. And Jung is not dismissing the value of aspiration here. He is only pointing out where the real labor actually happens. Aspiration alone leaves the unattended half of you exactly where it was, still unseen, still accumulating, still waiting its turn. You can spend years picturing yourself as patient and generous and still be ambushed by an old resentment you never once looked at directly, because imagining the light was never the same operation as facing what the light does not reach. The darkness does not dissolve because you have gotten skilled at describing its opposite. Think of it this way. A man can spend a decade telling himself he is calm, repeating it in the mirror, believing it sincerely, and still find his hands shaking with an anger he has no name for. The moment his patience is truly tested, the affirmation was never false exactly. It simply never reached the room where the real material was waiting. That is the whole difference between imagining figures of light and making the darkness conscious. One changes the story you tell. The other changes what you actually know about yourself. Second, consider why so few people actually do this, even though it sounds almost obvious once spoken aloud. Imagine a woman, call her composite, who has spent her whole adult life being known in her family as the reasonable one, the one who mediates, who stays even-tempered at holiday dinners while everyone else frays, and one November evening, over a small disagreement about who should host the next gathering, she feels a sudden heat rise in her chest that genuinely surprises her. A wish to say something cutting and final. She does not say it. She excuses herself to the kitchen, runs the tap, tells herself she is only tired from the drive, and by the time she returns to the table, she has already forgotten the moment occurred at all. And this, precisely, is where Jung's teaching stops being theory and becomes practical. Not in some rare dramatic breakdown, but in a small kitchen moment nobody else even notices. If she never asks herself what that flash of heat actually was, it does not vanish. It simply adds itself to a private ledger she is not keeping, and that ledger, quietly, over years, becomes exactly the density Jung described in the first key tonight. The ego resists this kind of examination, for a very understandable reason. Her whole identity inside that family rests on being the reasonable one. So a flicker of something sharp and ungenerous in her feels less like ordinary human weather and more like a threat to the entire structure she has spent decades building. So she protects the structure instead of looking honestly at the weather. And this is not a flaw particular to her. Everyone does some version of this. Everyone keeps one room in the house of the self that the ego guards a little too carefully, a little too quickly, a little too defensively. And notice something else in her story. The moment did not arrive when she was alone or unobserved. It arrived at exactly the gathering where her whole identity as the reasonable one was on display. That is not coincidence. The shadow tends to surface precisely where the persona is working hardest, because that is where the gap between the presented self and the whole self grows widest, and widest gaps are where pressure finds its way through. She will likely have another such evening, another holiday, another small disagreement, and if the pattern goes unexamined, the heat in her chest will not shrink over the years. It will only wait for a moment when the kitchen is not close enough to retreat to. Third, consider the actual practice, because insight without practice tends to fade by morning. Here is a simple exercise Jung's approach would suggest. Take a quiet 10 minutes this week and write what I would call a not like me list. Every quality you would insist does not describe you. The ones you would deny fastest and most defensively: greedy, cowardly, cruel, petty, vain. Write the list honestly, Then for each word, ask yourself a smaller and more specific question. Not am I this, but when? When this week? When this month? When in the last year did a small flicker of this cross through me? Even for a second. Even if I immediately explained it away. You are not writing a confession here. You are only tracing a pattern. And most people find, once they actually sit with the list, that every single word on it has visited them at some point, briefly, quietly, and been dismissed just as quickly. Pause for a moment right now and pick one real word from your own Not Like Me list, just one, and let yourself remember one small, honest moment it showed up, without punishing yourself for finding it. That is the whole exercise, and it is enough, because the aim was never to catalogue your sins. The aim was only to reduce the density Jung described. Think of it almost as a quiet repayment. Every ounce of shadow you name honestly is an ounce that stops accumulating unseen in the dark. And here is something worth noticing about the exercise itself. The word that makes you flinch hardest on the page is usually the one carrying the most weight, not the one that seems most dramatic, but the one your mind tries fastest to skip past. That flinch is information. It is the ledger announcing where the largest unpaid balance sits. This is not about indulging every unworthy impulse the moment it appears. It is about no longer being secretly governed by what you refuse to look at. The man in the storm still carries his lantern. He does not become reckless because he has noticed the shape following him. He simply stops pretending it is not there. And that single act of honesty, repeated quietly, across years, rather than in one dramatic evening, is most of what individuation actually consists of. Not a sudden transformation, but a slow, steady, increasing willingness to be honest with the one person you can never actually get away from, yourself. And this is worth saying plainly before we move on. None of this happens in a single sitting. It happens the way frost slowly leaves a window in the morning sun, unevenly, patch by patch, some corners clearing quickly, others holding on far longer than seems fair. You do not need to see the whole window clear at once. You only need to keep sitting near the warmth. I make the darkness conscious one honest word at a time. The sixth key is, the truth of the shadow is not there to frighten you. It is there to complete you. Once you stop treating the shadow as an enemy to be defeated, and start treating it as an unlived part of your own story, something shifts. The fear that brought you to a title like this one, the scary truth about your shadow self, begins to soften into something closer to relief. Because the frightening version of this teaching would be that you are secretly a different and worse person than everyone believes, but that is not what Jung taught. What he taught is that you are a fuller person than your polished image has allowed you to be. And fullness includes weather you did not choose, capacities you have not used well yet, reactions you are still learning to meet honestly. This does not make you dangerous, it makes you complete. Let me give you an ordinary picture of what this completion actually looks like. Imagine a woman, call her Composite, who spends a Sunday afternoon with her family. Her sister says something careless at lunch, and a flash of old resentment rises in her chest. 10 years ago she would have swallowed it whole, smiled, and spent the rest of the day quietly cold without knowing why. Now she simply notices it. A warmth rising and passing, like a small weather system moving through a room. She does not announce it. She does not perform forgiveness. She does not punish her sister with silence either. She just lets the feeling be seen by the one person who most needed to see it, herself. And by evening, she finds she is not carrying the low, simmering irritation she used to carry for days after gatherings like this. That is the whole difference. Not the absence of the feeling, but the presence of her own honest witness to it. This is what it means to hold shadow and light in the same two hands, not choosing one over the other, not amputating the parts that feel unworthy, but keeping them close enough to see. The goal was never a life with no shadow. There is no lantern that casts no shape at all. Even the gentlest person alive still throws some shape behind them in the right light. The goal is simply to know your own shape, to recognize it walking behind you, without dread and without denial, So when that small unwanted impulse rises again this week, the flash of irritation at a friend's success, the flicker of envy over someone else's ease, the sharp word that leaves your mouth before you have chosen it, you will not need to explain it away or perform some correction to prove to yourself you are still good. You can simply notice it, calmly, the way you would notice a change in weather, without believing the storm defines the whole sky, and let it teach you something honest about the parts of yourself still waiting to be acknowledged. A shadow named quietly at 7 in the evening carries none of the weight it carried at 7 in the morning when it was still nameless. That is not a small thing. That is most of what a lived psychology actually offers. I hold my light and my shadow in the same two hands. Here is the whole picture. The shadow is not evil. It is only unlived. The brighter the image you present, the denser the shadow grows beneath it. Facing it honestly takes real moral courage, not a single glance. It speaks first in cracks and slips before you consciously choose anything. Making it conscious happens one honest word at a time, not in a single dramatic reckoning. And in the end, the shadow was never the enemy. It was the unfinished half of you, waiting quietly to be let back in. Every key tonight was really the same single turning. Stop managing the image. Start meeting the person. That is the whole of it. I make the unconscious conscious. I have said it once already tonight, and I will not ask you to perform it again and again. Just to carry it, quietly, the way you would carry a small, steady lantern down a dark road, aware now of what walks behind you, and no longer afraid to look. So here is the question worth holding as you go, not whether you have a shadow, everyone does, but whether you are finally willing, tonight, to stop being frightened of your own reflection.